Hello, and welcome back to the Drop Step podcast. It's been a quiet August. So I've been all the way over on the NBA pod. I hope you've been checking those episodes out, my August takeover of the NBA pod. But I've got a returning favorite back. I've got one of my personal favorite podcasters, and it's Chuck, aka Chucking Darts. Chuck, you're here to help me today. For the YouTube listeners, watchers out there, I feel like I need sort of a Freudian couch because we're going to be working through my draft philosophy, and Chuck is my therapist here today. Chuck is the guy that we're going to be working through this with. Chuck, how are you feeling about this? I think it's a monumental task, but as I said pre-pod, I think you're the man for the job.
Well, first of all, the pleasure's all mine. I didn't know I was being conscripted into that specific role, but I'm happy to do my best. This draft evaluation and feeling out what your own approach is very it's easy to get lost. The way that I think I've said it before is that you can lose the forest for the trees, but you can also lose the tree for the bark and the bark for the sap. There's never any harm in reminding yourself what is very, very obviously true. Even if it seems too obvious, it's probably not obvious enough, because this is a space and a task that attracts overthinkers, which I myself am one. And so you got to do the work, not only in understanding what you see, but understanding how you're approaching it. And so I would love to, Jay. What better time than, mid-August to undertake such a task?
Yeah, I don't think this is an NBA Finals kind of session. I think we've got the right time. We've got time to let these ideas breathe. But for the point of missing the forest for the trees, we're in a group chat together on Twitter where the messages I frequently see are, when is so-and-so's birthday? Oh, I thought it was May. It's March. No, it's January. No, it's February. And you're like, how much is this really going to affect this guy's NBA ceiling? So I think that's a bang on point in terms of let's start with the macro and we'll work our way into the micro, I suppose, or the specifics of it. But Chuck, this is a very sort of loaded question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an idea exactly of what your draft philosophy is? Is it more of a feeling? Do you have sort of your 10 commandments written down? How do you do this, man?
Nothing so formal as that, but there are certain things that I keep in mind. I think, none of this is going to seem revolutionary, I don't think. But number one, you want to look for players who generally either are or will very shortly be too good to play in every league except for the NBA. So that is traditional kind of production. And again, that seems very obvious, but lots of times, that's when projects get taken very, very high. What makes someone a project is usually because they have not proven that they can reliably excel at a pre-NBA level. And it's a mistake that lots of teams make. It's a mistake that I made, frankly, the first year I did this in 2020. My favorite player in that draft, when I was really just giving it a whirl, was Patrick Williams. I had Patrick Williams 1 and Anthony Edwards 2. And it's funny because I think Ant was also considered something of a project because his production was kind of up and down at Georgia. But I really projected a lot onto Patrick, given how young he was and the flashes that he showed. And he's his own discussion. I still retain some optimism, and he got paid and got his second contract. I think he still does have a good career in front of him. But it goes to show that the better player than Patrick, at least, leaving Ant to the side, was like Tyrese Halliburton, who was just very reliably productive in very obviously valuable ways in that draft year. And that's one part of it. And there's lots of different nuances to go down about what productivity means and how to identify productivity. But the general sort of box score stuff, the traditional stuff, still matters a lot to me. I think that still is a handy way to look at how someone is affecting a game. You also want to incorporate how efficient they're being, of course. and whether or not their team is winning. That does matter. You get your exceptions like Ant, whose Georgia team was not very good. But production really, really matters. Number two is about whether or not they are an NBA athlete. That is very, very important. I think that a mistake that is made is conflating NBA athleticism with projecting NBA stardom. I think
Right.
one thing that I am continuously working on, and something I've made mistakes with, and it's not like a bright line rule, but I think lots of times if you identify someone who you believe is clearly athletic enough to play in the NBA, could lead to a fairly aggressive evaluation where, if you think about it, the NBA by definition is full of NBA athletes. I mean, that is what they are. And so there's a different task in identifying someone who will be an NBA athlete and someone who will excel and help their team beat all other NBA athletes. You have to sort of separate what qualifies someone as a league player versus what merits a really high draft pick because you're building a team to actually win. And that last point, building a team to actually win, is, I guess, another part of my process, I guess, is just trying to identify people who I think are going to score efficiently at the NBA level. That's really what stars are, all stars. I've made this point before in my writing and I think on my podcast, but NBA stars come in different shapes and sizes. You know, Trae Young is small. Donovan Mitchell's small. Tyrese Halliburton is very slight. You know, or on the other side of the ledger, you know, LeBron is this incredible athletic marvel. Wembanyama's enormous. You know, they look different, but the one trait they all share in common is that they score the ball efficiently. So as an evaluator, you need to figure out which players project to do that. And if their production and their track record is telling you one thing, which is basically that they're not that efficient, you better be very confident about how that is going to reverse itself when they get into a league of much more difficult competition, the best competition in the world. Again, another thing that really screamed about Halliburton, which was, I think he got knocked a little bit for his aesthetics and for his size, for his inability to reliably blow by people. But what was undeniable about him in his 2 years at Iowa State is how efficiently he scored. He scored efficiently as an off-ball supporting player as a freshman, and it's not easy to be an efficient freshman, even in a supporting capacity. And he scored efficiently as an on-ball guy as a sophomore. And so you could reasonably assume that he was going to be an efficient player at the NBA level. And as soon as you're efficient and you know someone's athletic enough to be there, that's when you can start to get a bit more aggressive. And so I've skipped over a lot. I mean, there's a difference between trying to find stars and trying to find role players and winning role players. But I would start with those three things: productivity and understanding what productivity matters, identifying an NBA athlete from a non-NBA athlete, and understanding the value of efficient scoring and what a person's pre-NBA efficiency says about their projection.
Yeah, guys, if you want to hear more about what Chuck has to say on this, one of the reasons why I invited him on this particular episode of the podcast, I'd invite Chuck on every episode of the Drop Step I do. He's just that good at what he does. But he splices in these little sort of philosophical musings into whatever he's talking about, whether that be sort of hard player analysis, to where a lot of the points that Chuck has just made, I feel like I've maybe heard in part, just sort of in passing, when you're having these discussions with whoever you might have on Chuck and Darts. You know, this idea of an overwhelming athletic advantage is something that not only can, you know, maybe lead to stardom in the traditional sense, like you just touched on, but that idea of not necessarily a floor guarantee, but it's something as even as that athleticism wanes, it's waning back to a level that's still sort of above NBA average. I think you've
Right.
spoken about that with Nick Batum, and I've always really enjoyed those points. But it's not important how you do it; it's important if you do it. On the topic of efficiency, I think that's where a lot of people can get a little bit confused with regards to sort of some of the aesthetic biases that Chuck was talking about there, in particular with Tyrese Halliburton. But I think what I want to do now is I'm going to outline a couple of really, really basic things, quick sort of elevator 30-second pitch. I think that most people that scout the draft think this kind of stuff. I balance a film and a data driven approach. I think that that's the best way to do it.
Mhm.
Can't just be one without the other in today's world. I would say that because I'm doing this from an amateur perspective, a lot of the time I will be watching the bigger prospects on film first, or maybe the bigger schools where you have sort of multiple first round potential players, where it's like, great, I'm killing two birds with one stone here. I'm getting to watch Rob Dillingham and Reed Shepherd and Zvonimir Ivicic today when I'm tuning into this Kentucky game, as opposed to sort of tuning into a mid-major team. And then when it comes to trying to scout maybe guys that haven't necessarily popped up in the sort of pre-class preamble, that's where the data comes in. And it's fine if you come to a guy a little bit late. We've got great sort of resources in terms of being able to catch up on what a guy looks like on film. So, if you're talking about smaller schools, I am happy to admit I'm not tuning in to every single sort of NCAA team. It is just not feasible with my accent, my location, and the time that I've got to scout the draft. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because I've heard differing opinions on this from people that I really respect in the industry, is how much do you factor other people's work and other people's opinion into your evaluation? Because a couple of the really, really great analysts that I've had on the drop step, I won't name names, they've sort of said this in the past to me, just sort of in passing. They're very strict about saying, I'll be honest, I don't want to read anyone else's work. I don't want to, scroll through Twitter every day and see what the general consensus is on who the NBA top 10 is, because I want my evaluation to be my evaluation. But to me, that idea grates a little bit, because NBA Twitter is a great place, draft Twitter is a great place, and there are a lot of great people doing great work out there. Chuck, how do you feel about the idea of balancing staying true to yourself and also not necessarily like being able to admit when you're wrong, but being able to use secondary sources if we get a little bit technical with it? And how does that sort of come into your draft evaluation process?
Great question. First of all, it's okay to be wrong about sports. If you listen to my podcast, that's what I say at the end of every episode. So I like to think that that is an area where I don't like that kind of stuff doesn't really get to me. I think doing this, and I think I started it later in life than a lot of people. Like I was in my early 30s when I started it. And I think a lot of people who get into the space and are really hungry and have the time to dedicate to it are in their like late teens or early 20s. And I don't want to be too broad in talking about being that age, but when I was that age, I was not as certain of like my own voice and how confident I was in what I thought about anything. I will
Mm,
still have periods where there's something I can't figure out or pin down about a prospect, but
yeah.
I do feel confident that I can have my own opinion about them and stand behind my own opinion. So I think as long as you know that, as long as you have faith in your own process, I don't see a problem in reading other people's stuff at all. I mean, some people are really good resources. Some people might point out things that you hadn't considered.
Mm,
And there's not gonna like everyone has their own individual approach that they bring to everything and their conclusions. Like everyone's just a different person. So it even if you set out trying to mimic a certain person, thinking that that person is really really good and you want to build off what they do, inevitably you are going to come to different conclusions. Like you just are. If you really want to do this and you want to watch the film yourself, you're going to come to different conclusions. It's just inevitable. So I don't, while I am cognizant that you like, my buddy Matt Powers does this for Swish Theory, and he's really, really good. He came on my podcast and he advocated for Zach Edey as number one on his board during March Madness. I, at the time, did not have him number one. I knew I liked him. I didn't have him that high, and I eventually ended with Zach number one on my board. I sort of went back and forth on that. I wasn't as confident in Zach as Matt was, but the fact that Matt appeared on my podcast and made that great case for him did not in any way dissuade me from holding the same opinion just because Matt had it first. I like that kind of stuff. I'm just past. Like this is, I mean, we're talking about really, really, really good youth basketball players here. It's very hard to be like truly original. And if you are really going after being that much of a contrarian to where no one else can claim that they have your opinion, then you're going to end up making decisions based on that aren't good either. So like, you just have to trust that you are going to put in the work, and then your own voice, your own approach, your own conclusions, I think are going to flow a lot more organically.
So when I started up at university, I studied history at university. One of the things that really grated with me in the first few months of sort of doing your first assessments was this idea of having to cite everyone that's sort of written about a certain topic before, having to be very aware of everyone's ideas and sort of how the topic has evolved in terms of the way it's been discussed. And I sort of looked at it at first and I thought, where's my idea meant to come in here? This is pretty annoying. If I want to make a point here, I'm having to refer to historian A, B, C, D. What about young up and coming historian JQ over here? But I think that the more you do it, the more you sort of realize this stuff is out there for a reason. People refer to this stuff as a reason. And that's something that I'm really going to sort of carry through to my approach through the 2025 class. I'm an absolute pod addict, an NBA pod addict at that. I get through a lot of podcasts, so I'm going to hear a lot of opinions throughout the year. And it's probably going to shape the way, not necessarily the way I think about prospects, but it's certainly going to make me think, oh, so-and-so had that thought about that player. I'm going to go and watch some of them tonight. Or, maybe I'm going to hit them up and I'm going to start talking to them and say, I haven't necessarily seen this. I haven't necessarily seen that. So for the audience at home, I think I'm with Chuck here in saying it's absolutely fine to be wrong. Great slogan, by the way. I love the way that you've just got the intro nailed for Chuck in Darts. It's perfect. But I think it's really, really important to sort of bounce off the community. And like you said, if you're drawing different conclusions, that could be fine. Just make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons. But I think that sort of shapes the basic ideas. So now, Chuck, what I want to do is I want to move into, I haven't decided if we're going to go 4 or 5 things, but some of the minutiae that I wanted to run through you. This is when I really get on the couch and you sort of talk me through these ideas, right? So for my draft philosophy, point number 1, I'm stealing it. This is in the spirit of the conversation we've just had. I listen to the Ball podcast, and Trill consistently says the draft is the place for taking players that you can't acquire any other way, whether that be by a trade or through free agency. How do you feel about this idea of you should prioritize finding these things that are more difficult to acquire, even if certain archetypes that maybe are more sort of abundant on the free agency market or do often come up more in sort of trade negotiations, even if there are high tier guys there? How do you think that factors into your evaluation, the chance to grab something that you can't normally grab via other means?
Yeah, very important. Trill's very, very smart. His podcast is excellent. But I think when you mention archetype,
Yeah.
That's a very popular word in the space. I've used it a million times myself.
Yeah.
But you have to remember that archetype implies that there are lots of lots of a certain kind of player.
Mm.
And so it sort of goes against what you're saying, because you're like, well, don't you want to get as scarce a talent as possible that you can't find elsewhere? I agree with that, but I would hesitate in how you define what that player is. Like, you have to, it just comes back to when you do the work and you watch the film and
Mhm.
you do whatever statistical research you want to do, you have to make up your mind about how rare a certain player is, number one. And number two, how if is that player more a novelty and that's why they're rare? Like, for example, Andre Jackson from UConn, who's on the Bucks now.
Mm.
Very rare player. There are not many Andre Jacksons that play in his style. And he's very, very smart, very athletic. There's a lot to like about him. However, does his rarity project to excel at the NBA level, to get a lot of court time and to like affect winning? I think there's still reason to be optimistic about Andre, but
Mhm.
that is, you have to sort of understand and like have an opinion about what matters in NBA games, what decides NBA games, and whether or not you are acquiring a scarce player for those qualities, or if you're just acquiring a player that is unique. Kenny Lofton, unique player, very,
Yeah.
very unique. But how they actually fare in affecting winning at the NBA level. So that's more what it is. I think it's, again, because really great players come in so many different shapes and sizes, it is hard to be conclusive about what a really scarce talent looks like if you're going to put them in categories. These group of players are scarce versus these group of players are scarce. Because I think if you do that, you just end up looking at like, wings versus everybody else, or like
Yeah.
wings versus unicorns or something like that. And you could say that Alex Sarr is a unicorn. I heard him described that way a lot in this draft
Yeah.
cycle. And maybe he's going to be really good. But my conclusion on Alex is that every unicorn that he was compared to was a better draft prospect than he was. And so if he's going to be in the NBA, great. He can claim, membership to a unicorn group, but those are unicorns he's got to beat. Cade Cunningham is this prototypical wing who initiates a lot and is really good. What I wrote about Cade at the time, and I had Cade ranked second in his class. I really liked him.
Yeah.
But drafting him first means that you think that you are building your entire offense around him. So that means that in a playoff series, he's going to have to beat Jason Tatum, Zion Williamson, Giannis, all these guys who are in their prime, who are frankly all more athletic or are bigger than Cade is. So you have to make sure that you're not putting too much stock in sort of, or that you are, I guess, defining a group very narrowly. The broader you define a group, the
Mhm.
greater the risk that you are including membership in like rarefied air for someone who maybe has a bit more questions about entering that air. I still really like Cade, by the way, but I'm just, using him as an example.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you spoke about Patrick Williams earlier, where it's you
Right.
look and if you squint, you see the massive hands, you see the really young, you see the mid-range shot making, and obviously everyone was sort of like drawing these comparisons to Kawhi Leonard, and when the comparison is
The
made,
paw.
when
Yeah. The
yeah, the
paw instead
paw,
of the
not the
claw.
claw, that was
Love
the
it.
one.
Great nickname, by the way. I should mention.
Yeah, I'm sure. I don't know if he's as happy about it. We'll see. I think $90 million over 5 years, you can probably
Yeah.
stomach having a slightly less positive nickname than some of the
Uh-huh.
other guys in the league. But there is definitely this danger of saying, well, player X did it, and player Y looks like player X, so I reckon he'll probably do the same thing. Whereas the fact of the matter is, guys can look really, really similar, but the degree to how competitive the NBA is, if you're just a couple of percent worse at a couple of different things, you can end up having a completely different level of impact on the floor and sort of impact on winning. So I think it's a really good point that you draw on when you say it's really dangerous to get into this idea of broad archetypes. It's interesting that you mentioned Cade, because the second point that I have, and this is something that I think is being informed by some of the players that we've seen marooned by their large NBA contracts. I think that I'm a little bit lower on initiators and on ball creators than perhaps the draft consensus is, because I think that the league at the moment is showing us that you have to be Jason Tatum, Luka Doncic, Zion Williamson, name primary player that is an absolute bucket in order to justify that level of expenditure. Because if you are a couple of degrees below that kind of player and you end up being a Tyler Hero, I want to be very careful about the names I'm going to mention here, because I was going to say Jordan Poole, and I think that's harsh. Zach Levine, a guy that is really, really close to my heart. I've done
I
video
know.
work.
Yeah, great video. Yeah.
Cheers, man. Guys, go and check that out. Link in the description, blah, blah, blah. But there's this idea that those players tend to cost the same amount as the really, really good initiators because of their skill set. So I think that it's hard to look at the draft and say, you've got to go and get an initiator. You've got to go and get a guy that can create a shot. You've got to go and get a guy that can run a pick and roll. When the NBA currently is reflecting that these guys are really, really valuable on their rookie contracts, and then suddenly nobody wants them unless they are the absolute creme de la creme. How are you coming round on this idea of initiation versus maybe secondary supporting skills, and perhaps sort of a changing of the guard in terms of the things that we really value? Maybe not at number one, but in the mid to late lottery or even the high lottery.
Yeah, it's something you really have to think about when you are evaluating. Scoot. I like Scoot. I really do. And I still think that Scoot has, and when I evaluated him, I was looking very hard at where I thought the scoring efficiency was going to come from. And I thought that he was a really gifted finisher around the rim. That's at least what I thought when I watched him. And so I thought that that was going to be a ticket for him. But if you if you're wrong about something like that, there's a real risk, because it's not like Scoot has wing size to fall back on. And that's really where the wing obsession, that's where it's still being felt, is that if you have wing dimensions, it means you are more likely to be defensively versatile, and it means that you are more likely to get multiple chances in different sorts of lineups, and if you not just Scoot, but say Jaden Ivey is another one that we're waiting on to see the real offensive efficiency. What Jaden and Scoot have in common is that they weren't clearly gifted shooters, and they weren't clearly high volume 3-point shooters before they entered the NBA. And it's something people wanted to project onto them. Now, the broader part of your question about running a pick and roll, I do think that that is important. I think it will continue to be important.
Yep.
I think that where the NBA is going to go, maybe not right away, but where it is slowly creeping toward, is you look at how the Celtics or the Thunder play, and every player is a threat in multiple ways when they receive the ball on offense. I just think that that's going to be what wins and keeps winning, is there's lots of really, really great resources and great people that you can find really breaking down X's and O's. And I think that a lot of that stuff is worth anyone's time. But at the end of the day, in the playoffs, what wins is usually the defense making strategic choices about who to sag off and who not to. And there might be ways that they disguise that, and there might be ways that offenses try to beat that and leverage someone as a screener off the ball or whatever. But very basically, fundamentally, obviously, if you are not as much of a threat on offense, a defense is going to pay you less attention. And that gives them just a little bit better chance of making it a little bit harder on your offense so that when the other team gets the ball back, their offense can be that much more efficient. That's how a lot of series are decided. And it's not an accident that like the Thunder and the Celtics were sort of better at volume and efficiency shooting threes than anyone else was last year. Not an accident. That doesn't just speak to their shooting talent, but it speaks to the looks they create through relentless drives from everywhere on the floor and how they make sure that they're constantly drawing the opposing big out. So, getting back to secondary skills versus that, you got to understand, I guess, whether or not a player projects to add, like, what kind of threat are they going to be? What sort of a chance are they going to get to be on an NBA floor? And what skills can they rely on right away versus what skills can they realistically develop? Like my favorite player that I've scouted is Trey Murphy III. That's not really a big secret because he was nice enough to appear on my podcast, and I loved watching him as a prospect, loved watching him as a pro. He is a low dribble guy. He has these secondary skills that really, really play up and can fit in like any lineup. And I think that his dribbling has really come along. And I think they could lean into it even more in Oklahoma City, or pardon me, in New Orleans. Yeah. But the reason that he's gotten the chance to develop those skills in the first place is because he is like legitimately a world-class shooter. World-class, and has the rare enough dimensions where he's a legit 6'9" to where he can get on the floor being raw at that other stuff first and have the ability to figure everything else out. By the same token, another guy who's a legit 6'9" and extremely athletic would be a guy like Julian Phillips on the Chicago Bulls, someone who got rotation run last year. I think he was a rookie last year. Yeah, he was. And looks like to be a rotation player for them, is going to be a wing, is going to get his chances, but he still has to get over the mountain of being a threat that defenses need to respect, even as a shooter. When he's on the floor, he's a player that other teams are okay shooting with for now. So you have to take everything like one step at a time. When that comes down to, what would you like to draft? You want to draft someone who is closer to that sort of multiple threat status so that they get on the floor. That's what I would say. And I think being able to run a pick and roll is something, but do you run it efficiently? Do you really break defenses down like at each level? Or are you someone who just sort of runs it, but it's choppy, it's inconsistent? Because if it is, then what might appear to be like a real asset of threatening offense may just be offense like a defense is fine with giving you. So you got to just pay attention to like, where's the efficiency? Where are they already really good? Where do they consistently score from already pre-NBA? And where do they not? And go from there.
Yeah. Trey Murphy, any guy that can be a dunk contest contestant and a three-point shooting contest contestant, they've got my vote, essentially. That's as fun as it gets, basically. I think he also had a 60-40 85 season in terms of his splits, but didn't make the 50-40-90 club because he shot too many threes. So he was 60% from two, and then he just shot too many threes to the point where his actual field goal percentage was below the 50% mark. So just such a fun sort of style of player. But I think you also look and you see these players that have been sort of thrust into lead or secondary initiator roles that have been drafted lower down in sort of either the late first round or the early second round. So three guys off the top of my head: Tyrese Maxey was taken 21. Jalen Brunson was taken, I think, 33, 34, and Andrew 33. Nembhard was taken 31, to the point where we've seen all of those guys get on an NBA playoff floor and be able to have an impact. I say have an impact. These are some of the best defensive players in the league. That's how high some people are on Andrew Nemhard anyway. Um, I think that one of the things that I'm going to factor in is that every prospect we watch from now has grown up with pick and roll centric basketball, has grown up with watching this sort of idea of manipulation and reading a defense and getting teal three off the dribble, or, knowing that right efficient offensive play. I wonder if the initiator skill set was perhaps prioritized because of its rarity in the past, and it was so valuable because there were less players that could do it, let's say 10 years ago. Whereas now we've had an entire generation that has just grown up watching this and grown up practicing it from ages, 4 and up. Do you think that these skills are just going to continue to become more and more prevalent to the point where other things like being a world-class shooter, having that length, being incredibly versatile defensively, is that going to be the differentiating factor going forwards? I don't want to say is that going to be the differentiating factor going forwards, but do you have any sort of thoughts with regards to that idea that every prospect we're going to watch in the 2025 class, they know what's valuable in the NBA today, therefore they're probably going to be better at it than the prospects of 10, 15 years ago?
Ooh, I don't know about that because the league changes along with the prospects. Like
Yep.
the players who are preparing for the draft now, going into 2025, they can only be who they are. They can only work on what they're going to work on, and so like they're that's running your own race is what a lot of people call it. And so a player can decide, I'm going to work on my 3-point shot because you need to be able to shoot threes to play on the perimeter in the NBA, which is true. Yep. But does working on the 3-point shot get them, like, are they truly gifted enough to do it? Or are they just putting in a bunch of reps at something where their actual skills really lean in a different direction, to where maybe they're a lower volume 3-point shooter, but they're great in the mid range? I mean, Brunson was a mid-tier 3-point shooter entering the league at age 21.
Right.
But he was such a dominant force in the mid-range and at the rim for a guy his size, really for a guy any size. And that's still the basis of his game. Like, you have to look at what you already, as a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old, what is it that has enabled you to be successful already? And I think this gets more into like player development that I am not a great authority on because I have never developed a player. But I would think that you have to look at what you are already really good at and becoming great at it. That's what I think. And I think that tends to be a pretty reliable path, as opposed to just trying to always work on your weaknesses all the time. Like, you have to make sure that you're really great at something on offense in order to get into the NBA. I don't really care who you are. So that, I think that starts at first. As far as what you mentioned about differentiating factors, the NBA is at a point where, and if I'm repeating myself, I'm sorry, but I'm doubling down on this obvious stuff, where everyone who is a regular, like a regular rotation player in the NBA, not even, let alone a starter, everyone is efficient at scoring in the NBA. It's just that some guys can be efficient doing it at high volume, and those guys are stars. Other guys are efficient at lower volume. Other guys are efficient, but they are not defensively versatile enough to be that much of a complement to star talent. And so those are the guys that become more rotation guys than starters. Starters are our 5 efficient offensive players. Mitchell Robinson's an efficient offensive player. It may not seem like it, but the shots he takes are shots that tend to go in pretty consistently for him. They're just lower volume in a very specific area of the floor. So starters are 5 guys who score efficiently, and a couple of them do it at high volume, and everyone else is trying to provide the defensive value to help cover for those guys. That's team to team. That tends to be it. So I tend to think that that will continue to be the case. What will shift and change is what efficiency really means and what are the pathways to being efficient. 5 to 10 years ago, you can sit in the corner and just shoot threes. And
Yeah.
that provided enough efficiency to your team that if you found a guy who did that and had defensive versatility, then you're good. Now that's a bench player because you really need more than just shooting threes from the corner to be good. You need to be able to drive and make a decision, a productive decision out of your drive. You should be able to, if you are on a cut or something, really finish at the rim and making sure that you can finish strong. And that's where, everything that is old is new again. There's such a temptation to draw lines between past and future because of how both groups of players talk about each other. But the reality is, even if the 3-point shot wasn't as emphasized in prior eras did emphasize being well-rounded, and usually they emphasize being able to play on both sides of the ball. And that is still going to matter. It's still going to matter. How it looks may be a little bit different about what qualifies as efficient and where it comes from, and what the duties are of an efficient player. But that is still going to be the baseline. So in scouting, it's inexact, of course, but you want to try to find players that are going to be able to play early and that have that pathway to improvement. Sometimes I'll say that I weigh the sort of wing-sized guys who don't have much of an off-the-dribble game. That is Trey on one hand. That's Jabari, who I ranked first in his year. That's Taylor Hendricks. And sometimes those guys don't, sometimes either by their own personal approach or by how a team is using them as a young player, they don't expand their off the dribble game as much as I want them to, or as much as I think they can. And then they're still NBA players and they're still threats, but the less diverse the threat, sort of the less important the player. So it's all in the soup, and you just have to sort of try to bet on guys that you think are going to improve in the right ways.
On the generations talking about each other point, I think we found out today that Ant Edwards would have been a generational NBA YouTuber because he said the most clickbaity statement I've ever seen. Just insane to win your gold medal, get to the conference finals, have your true sort of breakout, fringe top 10 player season, and then say, I think Michael Jordan was the only skilled guy of the 1980s, and then just sorry, I've got a dip from this 5-minute media junket. I'll talk to you about that later. But I couldn't quite believe that. It's sidebar.
But you're in Ant's defense, though. If he's look, I can cross someone up and take them to the hole and dunk on them, or I can hit a step back 30-footer. How many guys? And if that's in his mind, if that's what skill means, then not many guys in many previous eras can do that. Not many. That doesn't there's a lot more to that discussion, but I see what he means by that. It's just, he's Ant. Ant's going to be Ant.
You're a good person, Chuck. That's a very generous reading of a quote. You would not do well on first take if that's what you came out and said. There's some nuance to this. I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it. But
plumbers, soft. I don't know.
Oh, what are we doing? I think a point that goes sort of hand in hand with this idea of being slightly lower on initiators is this other idea that I was listening to Bill Simmons a couple of months ago, and I think that the Patriots were picking quite high in the NFL draft, and they drafted a guy called Drake May at number 3. He's their sort of quarterback of the future. And I was listening in, and they said, I think he had Mina Keems on as well, and they said, yeah, I doubt that Drake May plays this year. He doesn't have any sort of weapons to work with on the offensive end. He's just going to get absolutely swallowed up this season. They need to sort of wait and find him some guys that he can play with. And my heart went out to Cade Cunningham there, because I thought, we do not do this in the NBA whatsoever. You know, you get your guy, because teams tend to prioritize initiators. They often come in with either a blank canvas or teammates that aren't necessarily the best to sort of help them succeed, whether that's in their off-ball gravity or sort of their screen setting, whatever you want to call it. Often these young stars that we see brought in aren't necessarily playing in the most ideal offensive environments. What do you think about this idea? And it, once again, it goes hand in hand with being lower on initiation, of prioritizing getting the supporting cast prior to the star. So when they come in, they don't have to suffer the Jalen Green years in Houston. They don't have to suffer the Cade Cunningham years. They actually come in and they've got an environment where they can cook a little bit, and that builds some positive momentum in their career. Now, I'm not saying that if the Brooklyn Nets are number 1 in the draft lottery next year, they should pass on Cooper Flagg, because, you know, Roko Zikarsky is the big man that's going to make it really easy for their next star to be their sort of like pick and roll maestro. But this idea of drafting the supporting players and then looking at the initiator.
It's interesting. My opinion is that if you're confident someone is going to be a star, you take the star. If for no other reason that you would rather have the star than have to beat the star. And that's the thing. If you think someone's a star, you don't want them on another team, because then it's another star you got to beat, especially if your team's a mess. That's not going to be good. So if you think it's a real star, you take that player. If you think all of the stars are gone, then I think fit matters a lot and matters more than teams give it credit for. That's what I think. I think if you are like, we're drafting best player available at pick 41, I'm like, wow. I mean, like you have to either pick a lane. You either pick the lane where we say the draft is inherently uncertain and we cannot actually know who the best players are at the time. I think that's like lip service that a lot of people covering the draft have said for decades. It's inherently uncertain. But then you also can't say we justified this pick because it was best player available. Well, if it's uncertain, how do you know who the best player available is, especially throughout the draft? So I think that where those margins matter the most is at the very, very top. The very, very top. Because if you get a star, I am a believer that if someone is going to be a real star, they start to assert themselves very, very early. It's hard to find guys who end up being real stars in the NBA who didn't like really flash the first couple years in the league. I think it's hard to find someone who was sort of in the wrong situation, switched, and then became like a first or second all NBA player. I think that's tough. You can find guys who switch situations and then became very, very good. I think in recent history, you could look at like Lauri Markkanen and say that he's very, very good. And, you know, it's great that the Jazz have him. It's important that they recognize that talent and how they could leverage him. But number one, Markkanen also, I think, either set a rookie record or was second all-time behind Steph in threes made by a rookie. He was 7 feet tall. So it's not as though there weren't some sort of flashes. And number two, I don't know that Lauri's ever going to be like one of the 10 best players in the NBA, which would sort of justify, a top 2 selection, top 3 selection in the draft. That's why you have to be very diligent in knowing what a star is and what a star isn't. When you brought up Cade and Jalen, I think that the chances are neither one of those guys is a capital S star, because if they were, they would have contributed to winning a little bit more. That doesn't mean that they're not worth a max contract. That doesn't mean that they can't help teams win and win really, really big. But the real cream of the crop, like, you just really tend to see right away. There's not, I mean, it might take a year for it to translate to like improvement in win-loss record. I think Durant famously, his first season, they lost a ton of games. Giannis, his first season, they lost a ton of games. And this kind of segues into what you referenced earlier about birthdays. If you turn 19 your rookie year, almost always you're going to lose a lot if you're playing on the floor. But by year 2, if you're going to be a real star, you start to see you help circle the wagons pretty early. And so I think you just have to know the difference between a real star and a not quite star when you draft. And if you think there's a star, you just take the star. Is Scoot a not quite star? It kind of looks that way, but we'll see what he does in year 2. Is De'Aaron Fox a capital S star because it's taken him a while to find his way, or is he more of a secondary guy? I mean, important question. That was my comp for Scoot going into that draft. And so, you just have to know the distinctions between the guys at the top is what I would say.
One of the things that actually made me think about this is I met a guy called Luke Bourne, who is an incredibly talented sort of analytic maestro, let's say. And he was the sporting director at AS Roma. He's currently involved in AC Milan, but he was also very high up in the Sacramento Kings general manager, sort of like their basketball decision-making hierarchy. And he had got out of there pre-2018 when they picked Bagley instead of Luka, but he was in the room for the 2017 draft. And I think if you think back to that team, now this was a little bit before my time, but they didn't have any capital S stars or prospects sort of there waiting. But he advocated for picking Jonathan Isaac over De'Aaron Fox. Now, Jonathan Isaac, if you want to say capital S defensive star, absolutely. That's something that we still see today when you look at his per 36 numbers and the impact that he has on the court. That's absolutely there. But he's not a guy that's going to go out there and get you 25 a game and sort of take the game by the scruff of the neck. There's just this idea of, I think that you've really hit upon the point where you say capital S, small S star. But with Scoot Henderson, I had a lot of people that I really respect say this is the best guard prospect I've scouted since, I don't know, Kyrie Irving or, for a decade. So when you hear that kind of thing, you think, oh, well, that's a can't miss guy. that is a capital S. So it then comes back to this idea of, is the draft inherently a, sort of game of chance, so to speak? Or is everyone just missing something in their analysis and things sort of reveal themselves a little bit later on? I want to do 2 things before we get out of here. My final point was going to be, but I think that we've hit upon this sort of organically, is this idea of the prospects that you want. Yes, you want them to fit in the NBA today, but I think that you want to try your best to prophesize what the NBA is going to look like when they're really hitting their stride, when they're meant to be contributing to winning. And this idea of drafting sort of not future-proof prospects, but these almost space age players that perhaps profile as, maybe we haven't seen this, maybe this is a skill set that seems to be sort of suddenly emerging. 2 guys that I messaged you about during the 2024 process were Khalil Ware and Dylan Jones. And I would say that, Khalil Ware belongs to this archetype that we've seen sort of spring up since 2016 I don't know if he's necessarily going to be this guy that spaces from three, but the numbers back then indicated, I think it was 42% from three on low volume. He certainly sort of showed some touch from floater range. And he happens to be this mega athlete that, has a crazy wingspan and can be a pick and roll player and a rim deterrent. Not necessarily a capital U unicorn, if we're going to carry on using that. I quite like that. I will use that. But this archetype that seemingly looks to be incredibly valuable when you look to see what the Celtics did last year, when you look to see what the Thunder did last year with Chet at the five. And Dylan Jones is just a player that I really don't think we've seen. But I had this idea of, we've had 3-and-D players for quite a long time now, but 3-and-B players could be coming back, baby. Threes and rebounds, and Dylan Jones, one of those guys that just attacked the glass like no one else last year, and sort of had a real history of doing it. How do you factor in the idea of where you think the league is going with how you're going to scout next year's draft, Chuck?
Oh, it's a huge part of it. A huge part of it. I mean, one of the benefits of doing this year over year is you can stack draft classes against each other and see the commonalities in players that have hit and the commonalities of players that haven't hit. And so it's incredibly important to try to know where the league is going. That's why I mentioned the thing about having 5 players on the court at any given time who are all different kinds of threats to score from different spots, who can do it efficiently. That's where it's like, the way I think about it is that, like, if one team doesn't do it, will another team that they play do it? Like, or I'll word it a different way. If you got 2 teams, one team has 5 diverse threats and one team has 5 threats, but they're less diverse, which team is most likely to win? And I tend to think that as we go, the more diverse threats are going to win. That's what if you have more options to score on any given possession from more players, that is going to win more reliably than sort of teams that can spam 1 or 2 really difficult to stop things, but have sort of weaknesses elsewhere. And it's like, it's a hard philosophical discussion. You would say that the Dallas Mavericks last year were more of a spamming kind of team because they have Luka and they have Kyrie. They have that lob game for 48 minutes between Gafford and Lively with whoever was playing point. That's sort of like simple but brutal, like so hard to guard against. But they usually also had 1 or 2 guys that were a bit more stationary along the perimeter. They rode that to great success. So, like, it's not a none of this is a complete cure-all or prescription to take with you to evaluate every single thing. But I think one real value in understanding where the league is going is understanding which players are going to be on the chopping block. I think that's where you start. Understanding what is being phased out, and then sort of knowing how to rate that a little less aggressively in the draft. And I think what you mentioned with initiators, I don't think that's initiators per se, but I think small initiators, it's going to be hard unless you can score really, 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 really efficiently. A term that I came up with last year was NQW, which is not quite wings. If you have a shooting guard who does not initiate much, and they're kind of 6'5", 6'6", like James Bouknight, you don't really hear that name anymore. He was a lottery pick. He's a not quite wing. He probably could have considered himself a wing in 2014. Not a wing now. And I think another player, and maybe this guy will prove me wrong, but I think Jacoby Walter's kind of like that from this year's draft. And so, like, you have to understanding what players are kind of always going to be swimming upstream. You can start to eliminate them. And when it comes to trying to predict which players will really flourish, not just survive, but thrive, I think you can just, again, this is where you get in so deep in the rabbit hole. You're sort of like, wait, what is it that I value again? You rely on stuff that is very obvious. The most efficient scoring team is going to be the team that wins. That's been the case in the NBA since it started. It just, all that has changed is how efficiency looks. That's it. I think there was a time where the defense wins championships adage was like a bit more true than it is now. But what that means to me is that for a long time, offenses were just not that sophisticated. You have to remember, defense is reactive. That is a reactive thing that you're doing on the floor. The team putting the ball in play is the offense, and they will always have an inherent advantage if they're really on their shit and they know how to execute and they have the skill to do it. They will always have the advantage. Same way where in baseball, the pitcher puts the ball into play. If the pitcher executes and they're really on it, batters are going to be at an inherent disadvantage. I mean, you can do that if you're serving in tennis. Same thing. Like you have to understand what matters at that basic of a level and keep that in mind when you're scouting stuff. It's funny that in basketball, there's been defense wins championships and great offense beats great defense. Those two things existed. Like the same people said both things forever. And that is sort of counterintuitive to hold both those thoughts in your head. But the one that is more true is great offense beats great defense. It's just, and I think now teams are better and more tuned into what great offense means. There are more players and more talents available that can generate that. And it's just about keeping that in mind. That's why, yes, Victor Wembanyama is a generational defensive player. And, you know, he was obviously the number one pick in his draft class, but he is also a generational offensive player. And my guess for him is that his offensive impact will surpass his defensive impact as a player. And so that as long as you keep like those fundamental truths in mind, that can be the sort of thing that helps you distinguish between multiple apparent star prospects or like capital S stars from lowercase s stars and stars from role players and on down the line.
I love how that we've just I know that I'm going to use this capital S small s thing for the next few weeks at least. Thank you, Chuck. If I've taken anything from this, it's a really handy tool for explaining, you know, the creme de la creme guys. Because I was overusing creme de la creme. I must have said that 3-4 times in the last few podcasts, and I'm getting tired of it. I think on your sort of wing, not quite wing point, and just this idea of sort of cramming skill into your team as much as you can. Dallas is actually going to be a really interesting microcosm for that this year, because over the last few years, you know, since I can't remember if it was 21 or 22, their conference finals run, their starting small forward was Reggie Bullock. And, you know, Reggie's had a really good NBA career, but he definitely fits into this idea of a non-versatile scoring threat where you station him in the corner, but if you want him attacking a closeout, if you want him hitting above the break threes, getting into his bag, whatever, that's not necessarily going to be the best outcome for you. Whereas, you know, last year they get the likes of Derek Jones Jr., who has a little bit of juice off the bounce, Josh Green, who has a little bit of juice, you know, some extra passing stuff. And then this year, it's almost like a Pokemon evolution. We've gone from the starter Pokemon to their starting small forward could well be Klay Thompson. And if you want to talk about a guy that can score from all areas of the court, that's your versatile scoring threat that you were really hitting on there, Chuck. You know, we'll see if again, oh my God, we'll see if great offense beats great defense, because the defense could be a problem with Klay Thompson as you're starting small forward. Keep your eye on Dallas if anything this year, man. But I think just like final quick hitters, any franchises around the league that you look at and you think, damn, you know, if I could get to that front office, they're doing a really good job. They're really sort of switched on in terms of their philosophy. Who do you admire?
I admire the Pacers. I think they're very good. I think Carlisle was ahead of the curve in understanding how important efficient offense was. I think he was one of the first purveyors of like 2 and 3 point guard lineups because he understood the quality of looks that those guys could create, and you still see it. I mean, they'll play Halliburton, Nemhard, and McConnell sometimes all together. They try to make sure that those two of those guys are on the floor at any given time, and they really prioritize finding efficient scorers in the draft. So I think they're one. OKC's obviously very, very good, and Boston as well with this, not just through the draft, but with how Boston constructed their team, because they, like I said, they've understood that you want to have as many players on the floor who can at least make a decision, shoot, drive, pass, that kind of thing. I think there are limitations to that because you don't want to be sacrificing too much size, and you want to make sure that the passes that your team is making is not are not like overly predictable, because then the defense can sort of plan for the passes that you're going to make. But still, I think they've been at the head of the curve on that. I think in terms of drafting specifically recently, I love what the Rockets have done. I mean, they have had a lot of bites at the apple, but they've consistently identified players who I think are at the very least like they're very good at identifying like what is falling out of fashion and just like staying away from that. Like, who knows how good Tari Eason is going to be, or Cam Whitmore is going to be. But I know that there's going to be a place for both of them in the league. Like, there's not going to be a time where a 6'8" guy who's really versatile defensively, rebounds everything, and can shoot a little bit. Like, that guy's sticking around. And I think that because they haven't drafted much since this rebuild began with Jalen Green and Şengün in 2021. They haven't drafted much with the idea that like we are drafting for a puzzle that all fits together. Because I think right now there's a question as to who plays with who and what's the best construction of this team. And it's a big question for them to figure out. But you would rather have that problem than like the Pistons problem, where like you still don't know which of these guys to give all of the minutes to. I mean, that's hard. And so I admire the Rockets for consistently doubling down on players that for sure are going to be valuable NBA players down the line. And then that is like the ultimate example of sort of figure the fit out later. They have to figure the fit out, and it's very important, but they've taken enough guys to give themselves, I think, a good margin for error. I think Jalen is really the only one that you can argue that they have taken that didn't have very clear, very good shooting projection. He was a bit more of like a what's the word I'm looking for? Like maybe a live wire, a bit more live wire-ish about where that was going to go. But he clearly had scoring talent. I mean, he clearly did. And Şengün, Jabari, Tari, Whitmore, Amen, Reed, all these guys look different, but they all have somewhere on the floor where they are really dangerous and threats to score. And and a lot of them have wing size, and that's why a lot of them are going, like all of them, in my opinion, are going to stick around. So I admire them for doing that.
Yeah, and a lot of them have an overwhelming athletic advantage as well, which is something that you touched on when you look at sort of nuclear athletes in Cam Whitmore and Men Thompson. I think even Tari to an extent. If the size of your hands contributes to your athleticism, Tari's definitely winning there. But I just want to give a quick shout out to the Jazz. I think that there have definitely been questions with regards to what they've done recently with like the why aren't you doing the Philadelphia 76ers 2010s tanking? Why aren't you going out there trying to get number one pick odds every single year? What are you doing? But I think the fact that they have definitely created a favorable offensive environment for some of their initiating prospects to come into the league and try to improve in. I think if you look at some of the spacing of lineups with like Kelly Olynyk, Lowry Markkinen, uh, Jordan Clarkson, Simone Fontecchio pre-trade as well. Keontae George took his lumps in his rookie season, but if you're looking for at least space to operate in and certainly a compelling offensive system, that's one that certainly existed there. And I'm also really interested to see if they actually trade Walker Kessler, because I've got this sneaky feeling that they're so committed to sort of like 5-out spacing that they might just say, hey, we're going to run with Kyle Filipowski instead, see what we can get for Walker Kessler.
Oh,
Because,
yeah.
we're not sure about this. They took the gamble on John Collins, didn't they? Who's a guy that pre-manky finger injury was at least a credible NBA shooter. But yeah, I think you've hit upon it with the Thunder, with the Rockets. The Pacers are a really interesting one. Chuck, did the Pacers run any Jason Terry, JJ Barea, Jason Kidd under Rick Carlisle in the 2011 finals, or is that just like 3 guys that were on the roster?
Yeah, they did. Carlisle, yeah, of
So there you
course.
go. He's been doing
Yeah.
it for years and years and years.
Yeah.
Really, really ahead of the curve. Guys, I think that we're going to call that a podcast there, because I've had a great time with Chuck, but I think it might be time for bed in all honesty. Chuck, have you got any closing thoughts before we get out of here? I've had a really, really good conversation with you, man. So thank you for coming on.
My closing thoughts are that people don't understand the work that you put in and the sacrifice to your own sleeping schedule that you do with all of these whenever you have someone from the United States on as a guest. So go to sleep. You're the man. We love you, Jack. Just please be healthy and take care of yourself.
Guys, go and read Chuck. Go and listen to Chuck. Go and check out whatever it is he's doing. Go and subscribe to his YouTube channel. I was getting really annoyed because I'd watch the episodes on YouTube and then I'd see something pop up in my Spotify chamber, like, 12 hours later. And I'd be like, oh, I've got a new NBA podcast to listen to. And it's like, no, I've already listened to Chuck's episode this week. I'm going to have to wait for the next one.
I don't want that to be the effect. No,
no, man, you're too good. I just want more and more. But no, he's doing absolutely excellent work. He has done for a number of years, and long may he continue to do so. So go and check out all the stuff he does. Keep it locked into the Drop Step. Go and check out the NBA podcast, where I've featured quite heavily this month. Still got another episode to come this August. But yeah, exciting things to come with regards to the 2025 NBA draft class with the Drop Step. So keep it locked into both of us, hopefully. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure you tune in next time. Peace.